In April of 2003, a mid-list American thriller writer named Dan Brown published his fourth novel, and almost nothing about its arrival suggested what was about to happen. Brown's first 3 books had each sold fewer than 10,000 copies in their initial printings, unremarkable numbers even by the modest standards of genre fiction. The day of Vinci Code changed that trajectory almost overnight, landing at the top of the New York Times bestseller list in its very first week of release, and then, remarkably, staying there, on and off for more than 2 years, including a run of 57 weeks at number 1. Within 12 months, the publisher had gone through 53 separate printings, putting nearly 7 million copies into circulation, and by 2009, the worldwide total had climbed past 80 million copies sold across 44 languages, making it, by any reasonable measure, one of the best-selling adult novels in the history of publishing. What makes this commercial explosion worth pausing over, rather than simply noting as a piece of publishing trivia, is how unusual its engine was. Most runaway bestsellers achieve their scale through word of mouth built on plot, character, or prose style, the qualities book reviewers traditionally judge a novel by, and on none of these dimensions did the Da Vinci Code receive anything resembling unanimous praise. Stephen King, hardly an enemy of commercial fiction, memorably described it as the intellectual equivalent of a boxed macaroni and cheese dinner, and this was, if anything, a relatively gentle assessment, compared to what many professional critics had to say about its dialogue, its characterization, and its prose. And yet the book did not merely sell, it detonated, driven by something considerably rarer than a well-turned sentence. A premise, so provocative and so precisely aimed at a live nerve in Western religious culture that it managed to generate its own weather system of argument, denunciation, investigation, and counter-investigation, a controversy so old and so sustained that Brown's novel became, for a period of several years in the middle of the 2000s, less a book people read than an event people had an opinion about, whether or not they had actually opened it. The premise at the centre of that storm was, on its face, a fairly conventional murder mystery scaffold. A curator at the Louvre is found dead, arranged in a strange ritualised pose, and a Harvard professor of religious symbology, summoned to consult on the baffling clues left at the scene, finds himself drawn alongside a French police cryptologist into a race across Paris and London against a shadowy conspiracy. What set the book apart from 1,000 other airport thrillers built on roughly this chassis was the specific content of the conspiracy Brown chose to hang his plot on, a claim that the historical Jesus of Nazareth had married Mary Magdalene, fathered a bloodline that continued in secret down through the centuries, and that this bloodline, along with the truth of its existence, had been protected for generations by a real secret society and violently suppressed by agents of the Catholic Church. This was not, in itself, an original idea. Every piece of it had circulated for decades in a particular corner of fringe historical writing before Brown ever picked up a pen. What Brown did, with real craft, whatever one thinks of his prose, was fuse this existing body of speculation into a page-turning commercial thriller, and then make a choice that would define the entire controversy to come, insisting, both inside the book itself and in his public statements promoting it, that the historical and organisational claims underlying his fiction were, in fact, true. That single choice, more than the plot, more than the prose, more than any individual set piece involving the Mona Lisa or a stone cryptex, is what turned the Da Vinci Code from a best-selling thriller into a genuine cultural phenomenon, drawing formal responses from the Vatican, prompting a real lawsuit from real authors who claimed Brown had lifted their research, sending art historians and biblical scholars into newspaper opinion pages to publicly correct the historical record, and sparking a wave of tourism to the actual churches, museums, and monuments named in its pages. It also set off a secondary industry of its own. Dozens of books written specifically to fact-check, debunk, or defend the novel's claims, documentary specials produced by major television networks, and eventually a Ron Howard film adaptation starring Tom Hanks that arrived in theatres trailing protests, boycott calls, and outright government bans in several countries, all before a single frame had been screened for the general public. This series of essays is not concerned with retelling Brown's plot, which by now scarcely needs retelling, but with pulling apart the actual historical record his fiction was built on top of, examining one thread at a time, where his novel drew on genuine and fascinating history, where it drew on a decades-old hoax that had already fooled far more credulous audiences than Brown's readers, and where the resulting controversy revealed less about the distant past the book claimed to expose than about the anxieties, appetites, and blind spots of the early 21st century audience that made it into one of the most read novels in the history of the printed word. Anyone who opens the Da Vinci Code encounters, before the story itself even begins, a single page headed simply Fact, on which Brown makes 3 specific claims. The first concerns the Priory of Sion, which he describes as a real European secret society founded in 1099, whose membership has included such figures as Leonardo da Vinci and Isaac Newton. The second concerns the Catholic organisation Opus Dei, described as a real deeply conservative Catholic sect that had recently completed a controversial and enormously expensive world headquarters in New York City. The third, phrased more broadly, asserts that all descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in the novel are accurate. It is worth dwelling on this single page longer than most readers ever do, because it is, in a very real sense, the mechanism that converted an otherwise ordinary conspiracy thriller into a genuine controversy, and it is where the sharpest and most persistent criticism of the entire book has always been aimed. Novelists invent false histories inside their fiction constantly, and readers generally understand, without needing to be told, that a novel's internal claims about the past are a part of the fiction rather than a historical record. What made Brown's approach different, and what drew fire from historians, theologians, and journalists almost as soon as the book became popular enough to attract that kind of scrutiny, was his explicit front-and-centre assertion that specific checkable claims within the story were not merely dramatically plausible but factually true, an assertion he continued to make in interviews and public appearances well after publication, describing the historical background of his plot, including the claim of a secret protected bloodline descending from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, as extremely well documented, and stating that virtually everything in the book pertaining to actual historical events, organisations, and works of art was accurate. This is the move that transformed a piece of genre entertainment into something reviewers and religious commentators felt obligated to treat as a factual argument requiring rebuttal, since Brown himself had drawn the line between story and history, and had drawn it in a place many historians considered simply false. The specific claim that drew the most sustained fire was the one concerning the Priory of Sion, presented in the novel's fact page and reinforced throughout the narrative as a centuries-old, historically documented organisation with an unbroken line of illustrious members. This claim, as later chapters of this overview will examine in detail, rests almost entirely on a set of documents that had already been exposed well before Brown ever wrote a word of his novel, as an elaborate 20th century fabrication created by a single French confidence man with a taste for aristocratic self-invention. Brown's insistence on the Priory's authenticity, printed as fact on the very first page a reader encounters, became Exhibit A for critics arguing that the book's most sensational historical claims were not simply dramatic license, but a genuine misrepresentation of a matter that had, by the time Brown was writing, already been thoroughly investigated and discredited by journalists and historians working independently of him. Brown's defenders, and Brown himself, offered a consistent response to this line of criticism, arguing that the fact page's claims were narrower than critics assumed, referring primarily to the existence of these organisations and the physical accuracy of the artworks, documents, and locations described, rather than constituting an endorsement of every specific theory a character within the novel articulates about what those documents or artworks actually mean. Under this reading, when the character Lee Teabing delivers his lengthy, confident lectures about the true meaning of the Last Supper, or the true history of the Council of Nicaea, the reader is meant to understand these as the character's own interpretations, dramatically persuasive but not necessarily endorsed by the author as historical fact, in the same way a novel can accurately describe a real courtroom while still putting a legally dubious argument in the mouth of a fictional lawyer. Critics found this defence considerably less persuasive given how thoroughly the novel's own narrative structure validates Teabing's claims, treating his lectures not as one possible, contestable interpretation among several, but as the hidden truth. The entire plot is organised around uncovering and given Brown's own public comments outside the novel, in interviews where he was not speaking as a character but as himself, repeatedly affirming that the historical background of his conspiracy was solidly researched and substantially true. It is this tension between a legal and rhetorical defence of narrow factual claims and the much larger interpretive weight the novel and its author placed on the story built from those claims, that set the terms for nearly every controversy the book would go on to generate. To understand the single most consequential piece of research behind the Da Vinci Code, we have to travel back several decades before Dan Brown ever conceived of Robert Langdon, to post-war France and a restless, ambitious, and by most historical accounts thoroughly dishonest figure named Pierre Plantard. Plantard had a documented history even before the events that concern us here, of founding small, grandiose organisations with impressive-sounding names and inflated claims of ancient pedigree, and in the years following the Second World War he became associated with a genuinely obscure and short-lived French association that had briefly used the name Priory of Sion. What Plantard did with that borrowed name over the following decades is the actual origin story of the secret society Brown's novel presents to its readers as a documented historical fact stretching back to the Crusades. Beginning in the 1960s, Plantard and a small circle of associates began depositing a series of documents, now generally referred to by historians as the dossier secrets, into the French National Library in Paris, documents purporting to be genuine historical records establishing that the Priory of Sion was in fact an ancient secret society founded in 1099, that it had maintained an unbroken line of Grand Masters over the intervening 9 centuries, including such genuinely famous historical figures as Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli and Isaac Newton, and that the society existed to protect the secret of a royal bloodline descended from the marriage of Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene. Subsequent investigation by journalists and historians, conducted over several decades and involving direct interviews with associates of Plantard, as well as detailed forensic and archival analysis of the deposited documents themselves, established with a very high degree of confidence that the dossier secrets were not ancient records at all, but a modern fabrication, assembled and planted by Plantard and his collaborators specifically in order to lend a fraudulent air of historical legitimacy to Plantard's own claimed descent from the medieval Merovingian royal line of France, a lineage Plantard hoped, at various points in his life, might position him for some form of restored aristocratic or even monarchical status. In 1993, under questioning during an unrelated French legal investigation, Plantard was compelled to testify under oath, and in that testimony he admitted, in essence, to having fabricated the entire Priory of Sion mythology, a confession that, combined with the extensive documentary evidence journalists had already assembled, is regarded by the overwhelming majority of professional historians as settling the matter definitively. The Priory of Sion, as an ancient, continuously operating secret society tracing its lineage back to the Crusades, simply did not exist. It was a mid-20th century invention, assembled from whole cloth by a single ambitious Frenchman, for reasons that had considerably more to do with his own social aspirations than with any genuine historical mystery concerning the bloodline of Christ. By the time Dan Brown was writing the Da Vinci Code in the late 1990s, this exposure was already a matter of public record, chronicled in detail by investigative journalists working in French and English-language media over the preceding 2 decades. This is the central and most frequently repeated criticism levelled at the novel's fact page, that Brown presented as an established historical reality, an organisation whose fraudulent origins had already been thoroughly documented, tracked, and confessed to before he ever sat down to write his book. Brown's defenders have sometimes argued that a novelist is entitled to treat even a debunked hoax as useful raw material for fiction, and this is certainly true in the ordinary sense that any novelist can write a story built around a false premise. What made this particular case different, and what generated the sustained, specific criticism the novel received from historians, rather than simply the ordinary indifference most fiction receives from scholars, was the fact page's explicit assertion that this specific, already discredited claim was verified historical truth rather than an imaginative premise, a framing that misled a very large number of the book's 80 million readers, many of whom, surveys and subsequent journalistic reporting at the time indicated, came away from the novel genuinely believing the Priory of Sion to be a real, ancient, continuously operating organisation, a belief that historians and journalists who had spent years investigating and dismantling Plantard's fabrication found particularly frustrating to see re-legitimised on a scale of tens of millions of readers by a single page of front matter in a popular thriller. Not long before Dan Brown wrote a word of his novel, the specific theory at its centre, that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married and produced a royal bloodline protected by secret societies including the Priory of Sion and the Knights Templar, had already been assembled and published as a work of purported non-fiction. The 1982 book Holy Blood, Holy Grail, written by 3 British authors, Michael Bagant, Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln, drew directly on Pierre Plantard's fabricated dossier secrets, along with a wide range of other speculative historical material, to construct precisely the bloodline conspiracy theory that would later form the historical backbone of Brown's plot. The book was itself a considerable commercial success in its day, and had already generated its own smaller wave of controversy and scholarly rebuttal well before Brown's novel appeared 2 decades later, but it remained, in the years before the Da Vinci Code, a relatively niche phenomenon within the broader landscape of alternative history publishing, familiar to enthusiasts of Grail lore and conspiracy history, but far from a mainstream cultural touchstone. The relationship between the 2 books became a matter of formal legal dispute in 2004, when Michael Bagant and Richard Lee filed a lawsuit in the British High Court against Brown's publisher, Random House, which happened to also be the publisher of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, alleging that Brown had lifted the central architecture of their book's argument, its overall structure of ideas concerning the bloodline, the Priory, and the suppressed truth about Mary Magdalene, and repackaged that structure as the plot of his own novel, a claim of copyright infringement over the misappropriation of a book's central theme and structure rather than any allegation of literally copied prose. The case, decided in 2006 shortly before the release of the film adaptation, went in Brown's favour, with the presiding judge ruling that Bagant and Lee had failed to establish that Brown had copied a protectable expression of their ideas, since copyright law generally protects the specific expression of an idea rather than the underlying historical theory or factual claim itself, a distinction the court found decisive even though the judge's ruling acknowledged that Brown had, by his own admission, and by the evidence of his research notes, drawn extensively on Holy Blood, Holy Grail, while developing his novel's plot. The case became, in its own right, something of a minor cultural sensation, generating headlines partly because of the underlying subject matter, and partly because of an extraordinary detail that emerged only after the ruling was delivered, when observers noticed that certain letters throughout the judge's 71-page written decision appeared, when isolated according to a pattern, to be italicized in a way that spelled out a hidden message, a private code embedded by the judge himself as a playful, self-aware acknowledgement of the very subject matter of the case he had just decided. Brown, for his part, had already paid his own kind of tribute to the authors who sued him well before the lawsuit was filed, naming one of his novel's most memorable characters, the wealthy, erudite Grail historian Sir Lee Teabing, using a surname that is a direct anagram of Bagant, combined with the first name Lee, drawn straight from Richard Lee, a naming choice Brown has acknowledged publicly as a deliberate, admiring wink toward the 2 authors whose earlier, considerably less commercially successful book had supplied so much of the historical scaffolding for his own runaway bestseller. Given that Leonardo da Vinci's name sits directly in the novel's title, it is worth pausing to separate the historical artist and inventor from the figure Brown's fiction constructs around him, since the gap between the 2 turns out to be one of the more instructive threads in the entire controversy. The historical Leonardo, born in 1452 in the Tuscan town of Vinci, was indeed one of the most extraordinary and wide-ranging minds of the Italian Renaissance, a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, anatomist, and natural philosopher whose surviving notebooks reveal an almost unclassifiable range of curiosity, from detailed studies of human musculature obtained through his own dissections of cadavers to designs for flying machines and armoured vehicles centuries ahead of the technology needed to build them, to careful observations of water flow, plant growth, and the mechanics of bird flight. He worked for a series of powerful patrons across northern Italy and later in France, completed a comparatively small number of finished paintings relative to his enormous ambition and reputation, and left behind, in his notebooks, thousands of pages written in his famous mirror script, a habit generally understood by scholars, not as an encrypted secret code intended to conceal esoteric knowledge, as some popular accounts have suggested, but most plausibly as a practical convenience for a left-handed writer, since writing right to left in reverse allowed Leonardo to move his hand across the page without smudging fresh ink, alongside a possible secondary motive of simply making his private notes somewhat less immediately legible to casual eyes. What the historical record does not support, and what modern art historians and Leonardo scholars have repeatedly and specifically pushed back against in the wake of the novel's success, is the central claim woven throughout Brown's book that Leonardo was a member of a secret society dedicated to preserving the hidden truth about a bloodline descended from Jesus and Mary Magdalene, or that his paintings were deliberately constructed as an elaborate visual code transmitting this secret to initiated viewers across the centuries. There exists no contemporary documentary evidence connecting Leonardo to the Priory of Sion, for the straightforward reason, already established in earlier sections of this overview, that the Priory of Sion as described in Brown's novel did not exist as a continuously operating historical organisation prior to Pierre Plantard's 20th century fabrication, meaning Leonardo could not have been a Grand Master of an organisation that would not be invented, in the form the novel describes, for another 4.5 centuries after his death. This has not stopped the Da Vinci Code from generating one of its most durable and, in its own way, genuinely beneficial cultural side effects, an enormous surge of popular interest in the actual historical Leonardo, his genuine biography, his authentic technical and scientific achievements, and his surviving body of work, much of which had previously circulated mainly within specialist art historical circles rather than the broader public imagination. Museums holding Leonardo works, particularly the Louvre, reported significant increases in visitor numbers directly attributable to the novel's popularity, and a wave of new popular biographies and documentary programs about the real Leonardo followed in the years after the book's publication, feeding an appetite for accurate historical information about the artist that Brown's fictional version, whatever its inaccuracies, had inadvertently created. Art historians engaging publicly with the controversy have often noted this same irony, that a novel built on such a thoroughly fictionalized version of Leonardo's life and beliefs nonetheless succeeded, more effectively than most academic outreach efforts ever manage, in drawing tens of millions of ordinary readers into a genuine curiosity about who this 500-year-old figure actually was, even if the specific portrait Brown's fiction offered them turned out, on close historical examination, to be almost entirely invented. No single piece of evidence in the Da Vinci Code receives more sustained attention than the novel's reading of Leonardo's mural The Last Supper, painted in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan in the late 1490s, and depicting Jesus and his 12 apostles at the moment Jesus announces that one of them will betray him. In the novel's account, delivered through the character Lee Teabing, the figure seated to Jesus' immediate right, traditionally identified by art historians as the youthful apostle John, is in fact a disguised depiction of Mary Magdalene, her presence in the painting a coded acknowledgement, deliberately embedded by Leonardo, of her true status as Jesus' wife and the mother of his bloodline. The novel builds this claim on several specific observations, the figure's notably soft, youthful and androgynous features, the absence of any visible chalice or Grail cup on the table despite the painting's traditional association with the institution of the Eucharist, and the negative space formed between the figures of Jesus and this supposed Mary Magdalene, which the novel's characters interpret as forming the shape of a letter M, or, alternatively, a chalice, symbols the book reads as further coded confirmation of Mary's hidden identity and role. Art historians who have engaged with this claim in the years since the novel's publication have been close to unanimous in rejecting it, for reasons rooted in fairly well-established conventions of Renaissance religious painting rather than any need for exotic counter-theory. The depiction of a youthful, smooth-faced, long-haired John the Evangelist seated close to Jesus was an entirely standard and widely used artistic convention throughout Italian religious art of this period, reflecting John's traditional identification within Christian iconography as the youngest of the apostles and, in the language of the Gospel of John itself, the disciple whom Jesus loved, a convention art historians can point to in numerous other paintings of the Last Supper by other Renaissance artists working under the same iconographic tradition Leonardo inherited, making the youthful, androgynous appearance of this particular figure considerably less remarkable, in proper historical context, than the novel presents it. Surviving preparatory sketches by Leonardo for the composition, along with detailed technical and infrared analysis of the mural itself conducted during its extensive 20th century restoration, have not produced any evidence supporting an alternative, secret identification of the figure as female, and mainstream art historical scholarship on the painting, developed over centuries by scholars working entirely independently of Brown's later theory, has consistently identified all 12 figures at the table as male apostles arranged in 4 groups of 3, matching the Gospel account the painting was created to illustrate. The absence of a visible chalice on the table, meanwhile, which the novel treats as a significant and deliberate omission pointing towards some hidden meaning, is explained by art historians considerably more simply as reflecting the specific narrative moment Leonardo chose to depict, not the institution of the Eucharist itself, a moment traditionally associated with the presence of a cup, but the earlier, more dramatically charged moment described in the Gospels in which Jesus announces that one among the assembled apostles will betray him, a scene focused on the resulting shock, denial, and anguished questioning rippling down the table rather than on the ritual elements of the meal, making the absence of a prominently displayed chalice an entirely unremarkable feature of the specific dramatic moment being painted rather than evidence of any coded message. This section of the controversy has become, for many art historians and museum educators, something of a useful teaching opportunity in its own right, an occasion to walk museum visitors and general readers through the actual iconographic conventions, patronage context, and compositional choices genuinely at work in one of the most famous paintings in the Western canon, using the novel's popular but historically unsupported reading as a starting point from which to explain what the painting's original audience and its original artist actually understood themselves to be looking at. Unlike the Priory of Sion, Opus Dei is not a hoax or a historical fabrication, but a genuine, currently operating institution within the Catholic Church, founded in Spain in 1928 by the priest Josemaria Escrivá, who was later canonized as a saint and organized around the theological principle that ordinary work and daily life, rather than only formal religious vocation, can serve as a path toward Christian holiness. By the time Brown was writing his novel, Opus Dei had grown into an international organization with tens of thousands of members across dozens of countries, holding a distinctive and somewhat unusual canonical status within the Church as what is called a personal prelature, and it had also, for decades before Brown's book, attracted its own share of controversy and public scrutiny, including persistent criticism from former members and outside journalists concerning its recruitment practices, its internal secrecy regarding membership and finances, and, in the case of a minority of its numerary members who take on a stricter form of commitment, its practice of physical mortification, including the wearing of a small spiked chain called a cilice around the thigh for a period each day, a genuine historical practice with roots in older traditions of Catholic ascetic discipline, though limited within Opus Dei to a specific voluntary category of committed members rather than practiced by the organization's broader membership. Brown's novel took this real, controversial but ordinary religious organization and recast it as something considerably more sinister, portraying Opus Dei within the story as an organization actively complicit in murder and conspiracy in service of the Vatican's efforts to suppress the truth about the Priory of Sion's secret, most vividly embodied in the character of Silas, a self-flagellating albino monk who commits multiple murders over the course of the novel on behalf of the organization. Opus Dei's official response to this portrayal, once the novel's popularity made a public response unavoidable, was notably direct and sustained, issuing formal statements objecting to what the organization described as a defamatory and inaccurate depiction, emphasizing repeatedly that Opus Dei has no monks, since the organization has always been composed primarily of lay members living ordinary secular lives rather than members of a monastic religious order, that it has never been implicated in any actual murder or violent conspiracy in its nearly century-long history, and that the practice of corporal mortification, while real among a specific subset of its most committed members, bears no resemblance to the novel's lurid depiction of a murderous, self-mutilating assassin operating at the organization's direction. The organization's public relations response extended well beyond issuing formal statements, including the establishment of a dedicated website specifically addressing and correcting claims made in the novel and its subsequent film adaptation, along with public appearances by Opus Dei spokespeople in mainstream broadcast media specifically to push back against the book's characterization, an unusually sustained and organized counter-messaging campaign for a religious institution of Opus Dei's size. This response, whatever its intentions, produced an effect that has become a recurring pattern throughout the entire controversy surrounding Brown's novel, in which formal, sustained institutional objection to the book's claims tended, rather than suppressing public interest, to amplify it considerably, generating exactly the kind of ongoing news coverage that kept the novel's most sensational claims circulating in public conversation years after its initial publication, and prompting more than one commentator at the time to observe, with some irony, that Opus Dei's vigorous and well-organised defence of its own reputation likely did more to introduce the general public to the previously low-profile organisation's actual existence, structure and beliefs than any amount of the organisation's own prior public outreach efforts had managed to achieve on their own. The Catholic Church's institutional response to the Da Vinci Code was neither monolithic nor perfectly coordinated, reflecting the reality that an organisation as large and as globally distributed as the Vatican does not speak, on any given controversy, with a single unified voice, but the overall tenor of official and semi-official Catholic commentary on the novel, once its cultural reach became impossible to ignore, ranged from sharply critical to openly alarmed. Senior clergy in various countries described the book's central historical claims as a work of calculated anti-Catholic slander dressed up as scholarship, objecting in particular to the novel's portrayal of the 4th century Council of Nicaea, which the character Teabing describes as the moment at which the divinity of Jesus was essentially invented through a narrow political vote, a characterization that professional historians of early Christianity, whatever their own personal religious convictions, have generally rejected as a significant oversimplification, since belief in Jesus' divine nature was already widely, though not universally, held among early Christian communities well before the 4th century, and the actual theological dispute settled at Nicaea concerned the more technical and more genuinely contested question of the precise relationship between the divine and human natures within the person of Christ, rather than the novel's more dramatic framing of the council as the single moment at which an ordinary human prophet was retroactively transformed into a god through what the novel presents as a closely fought and politically manipulated vote. The Vatican's more formal, centralised response came somewhat cautiously and gradually, with senior officials in various Vatican departments issuing public statements expressing concern about the novel's potential to mislead readers regarding the actual historical origins of Christianity. And, ahead of the 2006 film's release, some cardinals went considerably further, publicly calling for a boycott of the movie, a call that, predictably given the pattern already established with Opus Dei's own response, generated headlines and public curiosity that likely increased rather than decreased attendance for the film among audiences who might otherwise have paid it comparatively little attention. Individual bishops' conferences in several countries issued their own guidance to Catholic clergy and educators on how to address the novel's claims with parishioners, and a substantial cottage industry of Catholic and broader Christian apologetic books emerged specifically to walk through and rebut the novel's historical assertions point by point, several of which themselves became modest commercial successes, riding directly on the wave of public interest the original novel had generated. Beyond the formal institutional response, the controversy also drew in a considerable number of professional historians and biblical scholars who approached the novel's claims not primarily as a matter of religious doctrine to be defended, but as a matter of historical accuracy to be assessed on ordinary scholarly grounds, regardless of their own personal faith or lack of it. And the near-uniform verdict from this quarter was that the novel's central historical architecture, the claimed marriage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the suppressed Gospels supposedly revealing this truth, and the deliberate, centuries-long cover-up orchestrated by the institutional church, rested on a highly selective and, in the judgment of most specialists in the field, seriously flawed reading of the available ancient source material, including a small number of genuine but later and theologically distinct texts sometimes called Gnostic Gospels, discovered in the 20th century and referenced within the novel, which do indeed describe a close relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, but which the great majority of toposhalists in early Christian history do not read as straightforward historical evidence of a literal marriage, given both the considerably later dating of these particular texts relative to the events they describe and their own genre conventions as symbolic, theologically argumentative documents rather than historical biography in any modern sense. This body of specialist criticism, running in parallel to the more overtly institutional and theological pushback coming from the Vatican and allied Catholic organisations, gave the broader controversy an unusual and, for a work of popular fiction, genuinely rare quality. A full-scale, sustained engagement from professional historians who felt compelled, given the novel's enormous reach and its author's own public insistence on the book's factual accuracy, to treat a commercial thriller with the same kind of detailed, evidence-based scrutiny more typically reserved for actual historical or theological scholarship. Where the Priory of Sion is a modern invention, and Opus Dei is a real but thoroughly mischaracterized organization, the Knights Templar occupy a third, more complicated position in the constellation of groups woven through Brown's novel, A historical organisation whose genuine and remarkable story has been so thoroughly overlaid, across centuries of romantic and conspiratorial reinvention, with invented mythology that the actual documented history has become difficult for many general readers to separate from the legend. The Templars were founded in the early 12th century, shortly after the First Crusade, as a military religious order dedicated initially to protecting Christian pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land, and over the following 2 centuries the order grew into an enormously wealthy and powerful transnational institution, developing sophisticated financial instruments, including an early forerunner of the modern letter of credit that allowed pilgrims to deposit funds at one Templar house and withdraw an equivalent sum at another location far away, a genuine and historically significant innovation that has fed, in later centuries, into speculation about the Templars as founders of an early banking system with connections to secret hidden treasure, some of which has plausible historical grounding, and much of which has drifted considerably further into outright invention. The dramatic and genuinely documented end of the order came in 1307, when King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to the Templars and eager to seize their considerable wealth and property, orchestrated the coordinated arrest of Templar members across France on a single day, followed by trials on charges including heresy, blasphemy, and various forms of ritual misconduct. Charges historians today generally regard as having been substantially fabricated or extracted under torture in order to provide legal and religious cover for what was, at its core, a politically and financially motivated seizure of the Order's assets. The Order's last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was eventually burned at the stake in 1314, and the Order itself was formally dissolved by Pope Clement V under considerable pressure from the French crown, bringing to an end, in its original institutional form, an organisation that had existed for roughly 200 years. It is this genuinely dramatic and well-documented downfall, involving real political intrigue, real torture-extracted confessions, and a real sudden institutional collapse that has made the Templars such fertile ground for centuries of subsequent legend, beginning almost immediately after their suppression and continuing in an unbroken line through Freemasonry, 19th century esoteric and occult movements, and eventually into the specific conspiracy literature, including Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that fed directly into Brown's novel. The specific claim woven through the Da Vinci Code, that the Templars served as the military and financial arm of the Priory of Sion, tasked with protecting the physical evidence of Jesus and Mary Magdalene's bloodline, and eventually smuggling that evidence out of the Holy Land, has no support in the actual historical record concerning the medieval Templar order, which functioned, as far as surviving contemporary documentation indicates, as exactly what it presented itself as, a Crusader-era military religious order focused on the defence of Christian pilgrims and territories in the Levant, rather than as the secret custodian of a suppressed genealogical archive. The connection Brown's novel draws between the historical Templars and the entirely fabricated Priory of Sion is, in this sense, a connection between a real dramatically fascinating medieval institution and a modern hoax invented more than 6 centuries after the Templars themselves had already been suppressed, a chronological and evidentiary gap that most professional medieval historians regard as effectively disqualifying on its own. The novel's central claims about the Order's true secret purpose, however genuinely compelling the real well-documented story of the Templars' rise, wealth, and sudden violent downfall remains in its own right, without any need for invented embellishment. Section 10. Mary Magdalene between Scripture and Speculation. Of all the historical figures reinterpreted in the Da Vinci Code, none has a more genuinely contested and actively debated scholarly history than Mary Magdalene herself, which makes her treatment within the novel a particularly interesting case study in how a work of popular fiction can land, almost accidentally, in the middle of a real and ongoing academic and theological conversation. The canonical Gospels describe Mary Magdalene as a devoted follower of Jesus who is present at the crucifixion, and who becomes, in 3 of the 4 Gospel accounts, the first witness to the resurrection, a position of considerable narrative and theological significance within the New Testament text itself. For many centuries within Western Christian tradition, however, Mary Magdalene became conflated, in popular imagination, preaching and religious art with a separate, unnamed sinful woman described earlier in the Gospel of Luke, and with Mary of Bethany, the sister of Lazarus, a conflation historians trace substantially to a 6th century sermon by Pope Gregory the Great, which effectively merged these three distinct biblical women into a single composite figure, often popularly remembered thereafter primarily as a reformed prostitute, a characterization that has no clear support in the actual biblical text describing Mary Magdalene specifically, and that the Catholic Church itself formally revisited and corrected in 1969, when a revision of the Roman Missal explicitly separated Mary Magdalene once again from the unnamed sinful woman of Luke's Gospel. This genuine, well-documented history of centuries-long popular mischaracterization has fed directly into a substantial and legitimate body of modern feminist theological and historical scholarship, developed largely independently of and well before Brown's novel, arguing that Mary Magdalene's actual role within the earliest Christian communities, as a leading witness to the resurrection and likely a figure of real authority and significance among Jesus' followers, had been systematically diminished and distorted over the centuries by a subsequent, increasingly male-dominated church hierarchy, uncomfortable with a woman occupying such a prominent theological position. This body of scholarship draws considerable additional support from a small collection of texts discovered in the 20th century, most notably a fragmentary work known as the Gospel of Mary, dated by most scholars to the 2nd century, considerably later than the canonical Gospels, which does depict Mary Magdalene as a figure of unusual spiritual authority and insight among the disciples, engaged in theological dispute with Peter over her own privileged access to Jesus' teaching. Brown's novel draws on this genuine and legitimate underlying scholarly conversation, but pushes it, in the judgment of the great majority of specialists working in the field, considerably further than the actual textual evidence supports, transforming a real historical case for Mary Magdalene's underappreciated spiritual authority and leadership within the early Christian movement into the specific, considerably more sensational claim of a literal marriage to Jesus and a resulting bloodline, a claim that even scholars sympathetic to the broader feminist theological project of recovering Mary Magdalene's diminished historical reputation have generally been careful to distinguish from their own, more textually grounded arguments, noting that none of the relevant ancient texts, canonical or otherwise, explicitly states that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, and that the specific textual evidence Brown's novel leans on most heavily, including a passage from another apocryphal text describing Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, rests on a Coptic word whose precise meaning and connotation remains a matter of genuine scholarly debate rather than settled fact. The novel's treatment of Mary Magdalene has, in this sense, occupied an unusually productive middle ground within the broader controversy, drawing sharp and specific criticism for its leap to an unsupported literal marriage claim, while simultaneously, and by the account of a number of feminist theologians who have written about the novel's reception, helping introduce a considerably larger popular audience than academic theology typically reaches to the genuine, well-documented, and considerably more historically defensible underlying story of how one of early Christianity's most significant female figures came to be diminished, mischaracterized, and eventually partially rehabilitated across nearly 2,000 years of subsequent religious history. Section 11. The Puzzle-Maker's Craft. Whatever verdict individual readers and critics reached on the historical claims underlying Brown's novel, there is a separate and rather less contested part of the book's success worth examining on its own terms, the genuine craft, drawn from Brown's own lifelong fascination with codes, ciphers, and wordplay that went into constructing the novel's puzzle sequences. Brown has spoken publicly about growing up in a household where cryptography was, in effect, a family pastime. His father, a mathematics teacher and textbook author who devised elaborate treasure hunts full of codes and riddles for his children to solve on birthdays and holidays, domestic tradition Brown has directly credited as the seed of his adult fascination with the kind of layered puzzles that became his signature as a novelist, and one specific childhood holiday scavenger hunt, according to Brown's own account, supplied the direct inspiration for one of the more elaborate puzzle sequences in the finished novel. The specific devices scattered through the book blend genuine historical and mathematical concepts with Brown's own invented flourishes in a way that rewards closer examination. The Fibonacci sequence, which plays a recurring role in the novel's early puzzle solving, is entirely real, a genuine mathematical pattern first introduced to European mathematics in the 13th century, in which each number is the sum of the two preceding numbers, and which does indeed appear with notable frequency in various natural growth patterns, from the arrangement of leaves on certain plants to the spiral of a nautilus shell. A genuine mathematical curiosity Brown puts to entirely plausible use as a numerical anagram at the centre of an early plot puzzle. The cryptex, the ingenious cylindrical lockbox device that features prominently in the novel's central artifact, drawing on a design the narrative attributes to Leonardo da Vinci himself, appears to be substantially Brown's own invention rather than a genuine historical device with documented Renaissance origins, though it draws loosely on the real historical existence of combination locks and coded mechanisms dating back centuries, repackaged by Brown into a specific fictional object with no direct historical prototype bearing Leonardo's actual design or attribution. Brown's fondness for anagrams, already noted in his naming of the character Lee Teabing, extends throughout the novel as a recurring structural device, part of a broader pattern in his fiction of embedding wordplay both within the plot itself, where characters must solve anagrams to advance the story, and outside the plot in the naming choices Brown makes for his characters and settings, several of which encode private references to real people in Brown's own life, or public tributes to figures Brown admires, a habit that has become one of the more consistently noted features of his writing across his entire body of work featuring the character Robert Langdon. This genuine puzzle craft, whatever the surrounding controversy over the novel's historical claims, is frequently credited by both fans and more measured critics as one of the more legitimately effective elements of Brown's writing, engaging readers directly in the process of code-breaking alongside his characters in a way that mimics, in miniature, the same kind of active participatory decoding that made the larger historical mystery at the centre of the book so viscerally engaging for so many millions of readers, regardless of how that larger mystery ultimately held up under historical scrutiny. Section 12. A guidebook full of wrong turns. Beyond the large headline-generating controversies concerning the Priory of Sion, Opus Dei, and the interpretation of Leonardo's art, the Da Vinci Code also drew a steady stream of smaller, more granular criticism from readers and specialists who caught the novel in a considerable number of factual errors concerning matters that had nothing to do with contested theology or historical interpretation, but were instead straightforward, checkable claims about geography, architecture, and physical detail that turned out on inspection simply to be incorrect. Some of the most frequently cited examples concern the Louvre Museum itself, the setting of the novel's opening chapters, where Brown's description of the museum's famous glass pyramid entrance, including a specific claim about the total number of glass panes making up its surface presented within the novel as encoding a symbolically significant number, does not match the pyramid's actual documented construction specifications, a discrepancy museum officials and architecture writers pointed out relatively quickly once the novel's popularity brought renewed public attention to the building's real design history. Other frequently noted errors involve matters of straightforward historical or geographic detail scattered throughout the novel's European settings, including inaccuracies in Brown's description of the layout and access routes of certain buildings in Paris and London that the plot depends on, discrepancies between the novel's account of the historical development of certain religious institutions and the actual documented timeline of their founding, and a number of smaller factual slips concerning weights, measurements, and physical properties referenced in passing during various action sequences, the kind of granular detail that ordinarily passes unnoticed in commercial thrillers, but that, given the novel's explicit fact-page assertion of comprehensive accuracy, attracted an unusually thorough and unusually public fact-checking effort from journalists, museum professionals, and enthusiast readers eager to test Brown's claims against the documented record. Brown has generally responded to this category of criticism, distinct from the larger theological and historical controversies, with considerably less defensiveness than he showed regarding the Priory of Sion and related claims, generally acknowledging in interviews that a novel of this scope and pace, moving rapidly across dozens of real locations and drawing on an enormous range of specialist subject matter, was always likely to contain some number of small factual slips here, despite his stated research efforts, framing these particular errors as the ordinary, forgivable cost of writing fast-paced popular fiction rather than a formal scholarly text. Critics and fact-checkers, for their part, have generally treated this particular category of error with correspondingly less alarm than the larger claims concerning the Priory of Sion or the interpretation of Leonardo's paintings, since an incorrect count of glass panes in a museum pyramid carries considerably lower stakes for the book's readers and for the historical record more broadly than a false claim about the documented existence of a centuries-old secret society or a contested reinterpretation of the origins of Christian doctrine. Taken together, however, this steady accumulation of smaller, verifiable errors layered on top of the larger and more consequential historical controversies already discussed, contributed meaningfully to the broader critical consensus that ultimately formed around the novel within the historical and scholarly community, a consensus holding that whatever its considerable merits as a piece of fast-moving popular entertainment, the Da Vinci Code simply could not be relied upon, at almost any level of detail, as an accurate guide to the actual history, art, and institutions it claimed, on its very first page, to be faithfully representing. Section 13. The Prose Debate. Separate from the historical controversy, and in many ways longer running within literary circles, is the debate over Brown's actual abilities as a prose stylist, a debate that has become, among professional book critics, almost as much of a fixture of the novel's legacy as the theological arguments it provoked. Brown's prose in the Da Vinci Code and his subsequent novels has drawn sustained and often quite pointed criticism for its reliance on short staccato sentences and chapter-ending cliffhangers designed explicitly to propel readers forward at speed, for dialogue frequently used as a delivery mechanism for lengthy blocks of expository historical lecture rather than as naturalistic character interaction, and for a fondness for adverb-heavy description and italicized internal thought that a considerable number of professional reviewers, including several writing for major literary publications, singled out as clumsy or unintentionally comic, generating, in the years following the novel's success, an entire minor subgenre of internet commentary and parody dedicated specifically to cataloguing and mocking particular sentences and stylistic tics drawn from Brown's writing. Defenders of Brown's prose, including some literary critics willing to engage with the question on its own terms rather than dismissing it outright, have generally argued that judging thriller writing by the same stylistic standards applied to literary fiction misses the specific and considerable craft involved in Brown's actual chosen genre, the architecture of pacing, suspense, and chapter structure that keeps an enormous and famously fast readership turning pages through a novel dense with historical and art historical exposition that might, in less careful hands, have brought the narrative to a complete stop. Brown's chapters in the Da Vinci Code are notably short, frequently ending on a revelation or a cliffhanger before immediately cutting away to a different character or location, a structural technique borrowed and refined from an established tradition of commercial thriller writing rather than an original Brown invention, but one that reviewers, even among his harshest critics, have often conceded he deploys with genuine and demonstrably effective skill, whatever the sentence-level prose surrounding that structure looked like on close inspection. This tension between a widespread critical consensus that Brown's prose style, judged sentence by sentence, ranks well below more literary genre writers working in similar commercial territory, and an equally widespread acknowledgement that something about the book's overall structure and pacing produced an almost uniquely compulsive reading experience for tens of millions of people who do not, by and large, read very much commercial fiction at all, has made the Da Vinci Code something of a recurring case study in academic and journalistic writing about the publishing industry more broadly, cited repeatedly in discussions of the sometimes considerable gap between a book's technical literary merit as judged by professional critics and its actual measurable power to capture and hold a mass-popular readership, a gap Stephen King's much-quoted macaroni and cheese comparison captured with Particular Economy, an assessment that was clearly intended as a backhanded critique of the book's culinary sophistication, so to speak, while nonetheless implicitly acknowledging in the very choice of that particular comparison that a great many people faced with the choice will happily and repeatedly reach for exactly that dish. When Ron Howard's film adaptation of the Da Vinci Code arrived in 2006, opening as the premiere selection at the Cannes Film Festival before its wide theatrical release, it carried into theatres essentially the entire weight of the controversy that had already been building around Brown's novel for the preceding 3 years, a controversy that the film's marketing and distribution, whether by design or simple consequence, did remarkably little to diffuse and arguably a great deal to amplify. Cardinals in several countries publicly called for Catholic audiences to boycott the film before its release, and the controversy extended well beyond calls for voluntary boycott into outright government censorship, with the film formally banned from theatrical release in several countries, including Lebanon, Jordan, Syria and Belarus, decisions driven by a mixture of religious and political objections to the film's central premise, while other countries, including India and several predominantly Catholic nations, saw organised protests, formal petitions to censor boards, and in some cases temporary local bans or heavily restricted releases, before the film was eventually permitted wider distribution. Critical reception of the finished film, once it actually reached audiences, was notably cooler than the surrounding controversy might have suggested, with the majority of professional reviewers offering a mixed to negative assessment, frequently singling out the challenge of translating the novel's heavy reliance on lengthy expository dialogue into a visually and dramatically engaging film experience, a structural problem that several critics felt Akiva Goldsman's screenplay and Ron Howard's direction never fully solved, resulting in long stretches of the film given over to characters explaining historical theory to one another in a manner that read considerably more naturally on the page than it played on screen. Despite this critical reception, and in a pattern the controversy surrounding the novel had already established as remarkably consistent, the film became a massive commercial success, almost entirely undeterred by either the negative reviews or the organised religious opposition, opening to an estimated worldwide weekend gross of $224 million, at the time the second largest opening weekend in box office history, behind only the release of the final prequel installment of the Star Wars saga the previous year, and going on to earn more than $760 million worldwide against a production budget of roughly $125 million, making it the second highest grossing film released anywhere in the world that year. Ron Howard himself addressed the wave of critical hostility directly in interviews at the time, describing the largely negative critical reception as personally frustrating while consistently maintaining, in response to the religious controversy specifically, that the film was intended purely as popular entertainment rather than any kind of serious theological argument, a defense closely echoing the position Brown himself had taken regarding certain elements of his novel's more sensational claims. The film went on to spawn 2 sequels, also directed by Howard, and starring Tom Hanks as Robert Langdon, an adaptation of Brown's earlier novel Angels and Demons, released in 2009, and an adaptation of his later novel Inferno, released in 2016, though neither of these subsequent films came anywhere close to replicating either the box office performance or, notably, the sheer scale of public religious controversy that had made the original Da Vinci Code film, whatever its mixed critical reputation, into one of the defining and most argued about cinematic events of the entire decade. Looking back across the full arc of this controversy, from Pierre Plantard's decades-old fabrication of the Priory of Sion, through Brown's decision to present that fabrication and its surrounding theories as documented fact, through the formal responses from Opus Dei and the Vatican, the plagiarism lawsuit, the sustained scholarly rebuttals from art historians and biblical specialists, and finally the boycotts and record-breaking box office numbers that greeted the film adaptation, it becomes possible to ask a somewhat larger question than simply whether any individual claim in Brown's novel holds up under historical scrutiny, most of which, as this overview has traced in some detail, do not. The larger and arguably more interesting question is, why a work of commercial genre fiction built on such a thoroughly discredited historical foundation was able to generate this scale and duration of genuine public engagement, drawing tens of millions of readers who do not typically follow academic debates in early Christian history or Renaissance art scholarship into a sustained years-long public argument about exactly those subjects? Part of the answer clearly lies in timing. The Da Vinci Code arrived in 2003 in a cultural moment already primed, in the years following the September 11th attacks, for heightened public interest in questions of institutional religious authority, and specifically for a particular strand of popular skepticism toward large, powerful religious institutions and their claimed monopoly on historical and spiritual truth, a skepticism Brown's novel tapped into directly by casting its central mystery as precisely a story of an ancient, human, historically contingent truth deliberately suppressed by a powerful institutional church for its own preservation of authority. Part of the answer also lies in the specific and unusually effective structural choice Brown made in presenting invented and disputed history not as background colour, the way most historical thrillers do, but as the very engine of the plot's forward momentum, turning the act of encountering and evaluating historical claims into the central suspense mechanism of the novel itself, so that readers were, in a very real sense, invited to participate directly in exactly the kind of historical detective work that professional historians and theologians engage in as their actual vocation, a participatory quality that likely did more than any individual plot twist to explain why so many millions of otherwise casual readers found themselves, often for the first time, genuinely curious about the Council of Nicaea, the Gnostic Gospels, or the actual documented history of the Knights Templar. The controversy also revealed something less flattering, and considerably more durable as a cautionary case study about the particular vulnerability of a mass popular audience to a confidently asserted claim of historical fact when that claim arrives wrapped inside a genuinely compelling piece of narrative fiction, printed with the simple authority of a single word, fact, on the page before the story even begins. Surveys and subsequent journalistic reporting conducted in the years following the novel's publication consistently found a significant proportion of readers who had come away from the book with a genuine, sincerely held belief in claims, the historical reality of the Priory of Sion chief among them, that had already been thoroughly investigated and dismantled by professional historians and journalists working entirely independently of Brown's fiction, well before he ever wrote a word of it, a pattern that historians and media literacy researchers writing about the controversy and its aftermath have repeatedly cited as an unusually clear and well-documented example of how quickly and how thoroughly a compelling narrative, deployed at sufficient commercial scale, can outcompete years of careful, unglamorous, and considerably less commercially successful investigative and scholarly work in shaping what a very large segment of the public actually comes to believe about the past. Whatever else can be said about the Da Vinci Code, as a thriller, as a publishing phenomenon, or as a piece of prose style endlessly debated by literary critics, it remains, more than 2 decades after its publication, one of the most instructive and most thoroughly documented case studies available for understanding exactly how and exactly why a piece of popular fiction can come to shape public belief about history far more powerfully and far more durably than the patient, evidence-based work of the historians whose job it actually is to get the story right.